I'll admit, I'm at a disadvantage with this topic because I'm not a parent. But when I look at Genesis 22, the so-called test of Abraham, I still get uncomfortable. How can God be good when he tells Abraham to sacrifice his son? As readers, we know this is a test. Many of us are familiar with the story, and we know that God stops Abraham before he actually goes through with it. But of course, Abraham doesn't know any of this. He just hears a command from heaven to do the unthinkable. And he is obedient all the way to the point of tying up his son and raising the knife to kill him before God sends an angel to intervene. To the average reader, the test seems outrageously cruel, totally unnecessary, and inevitably traumatizing for both Abraham and his son Isaac. But as we pick apart this story, we start to see that a different picture of God emerges than what we originally thought. So for instance, when God first speaks to Abraham to sacrifice his son, there's a small Hebrew word that usually gets lost in translation, the word na. This word is used to soften the request, similar to how we use the word please. God's tender request shows that he is not a cosmic bully trying to assure himself that Abraham would mindlessly obey him. Cosmic bullies don't talk like that. So how do we understand this story? I would argue that the answer is found when we understand the kind of test that God is giving to Abraham. This will take some explanation, but you will see it's a game changer. The thing is, most readers assume that God is testing Abraham's what? His obedience. In other words, will Abraham do what God tells him to do, even with the hardest commandments you could imagine? Sure enough, Abraham is obedient. Huzzah, he passed the test. But I don't think God was testing Abraham's obedience here. God was testing Abraham's faith. Faith is a forward-looking trust in God's promises displayed through obedience. Hebrews 11 is famous for examples of faith, and practically every example of faith in Hebrews 11 fits this definition. In fact, Abraham's test to sacrifice his son is one of those examples. It was a test of faith. So Abraham is believing a promise of God. What is he believing? Well, the story of Abraham's test does not explicitly tell us, but it fits in a larger context. Earlier, God made a promise to Abraham that he would have a son in his old age, and this son would grow up to build a family, multiply, and eventually become a great nation. So Isaac is born in their old age, this miracle baby whose presence would remind Abraham every day that God was faithful to keep his promise. And if God wasn't clear enough, he told Abraham explicitly that Isaac is the child. Isaac will become a great nation. That's the context. So we get to Genesis 22, where God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. This test of faith, then, was to see if Abraham really trusted God that their miracle baby Isaac would grow up to father a great nation. Why does this matter? Because if Abraham really had faith in God's promise for Isaac, well, that means Abraham would have believed that this sacrifice would not end with Isaac's death. Obviously, it still would have been hard for Abraham to climb that mountain with his son, but this isn't a tormented father preparing to say goodbye to his son forever. This is a man walking in tremendous obedience because he is convinced that somehow, some way, Isaac will come back down that mountain with him. It's a whole lot easier to get on a plane when you know and believe the pilot can land it safely. I'm not making this interpretation up. It's right there in our story. Abraham sees the mountain of sacrifice in the distance. He says to his servants, "The boy and I will travel a little farther. We will worship there, and then we will come right back." Later, Isaac asks Abraham what he intends to sacrifice. Abraham tells Isaac that God will provide the sacrifice. I don't think he's lying. In fact, the interpretation I'm arguing for is pretty much exactly the way it's argued in Hebrews 11. Look at this. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, even though God had told him, "Isaac is a son through whom your descendants will be counted." Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again, and in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. I suspect this test was really for Abraham more than it was for God. God always knows Abraham's heart. He can see Abraham's faith, but I think Abraham needed to see his own faith play out. There are some earlier stories where Abraham lacked faith. He didn't always trust God's promises, but after seeing God pull through for him again and again, now was the time for Abraham to exercise his faith so that he could learn to trust God with anything. I'm sure many of us Christians would agree that when our faith is tested, we come out stronger and deeper in our relationship with God. There is one more loose end to this story. Isaac. We often picture him as a little boy in this story, kicking and screaming as his father suddenly turns the tables on him at the top of the mountain, binding him with rope and lifting the knife over his head. I mean, talk about childhood trauma. The thing is, though, this picture of a struggling young boy doesn't quite fit. One reason is he probably wasn't a young boy. The Hebrew word for boy here is used for a broad range of ages, from children to young adults. We don't know Isaac's age in this story, but he was at least old enough to journey for several days and climb a mountain carrying firewood. So he would have been pretty strong. His father Abraham, on the other hand, was well over 100 years old. Put that together. If this sacrifice put Isaac in emotional turmoil, he would have resisted. If he resisted, he probably would have won. In fact, there is a strong Jewish tradition that says Isaac's faith was just as strong as Abraham's. They even suggest that Isaac requested to be bound, lest he changed his mind in the final moment of testing. I suspect Isaac's experience in this ordeal would have been like any believer who trusts their soul to God in their final moments of life. What a marvelous experience it will be when faith becomes sight and God fulfills his promise to resurrect us from the dead and welcome us home. The next video in this series will look at how God can be good when the Bible is so saturated in maleness. It seems racist. There's obviously a lot of abuse in the church against women. What do we do with that? So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.